Eastern to begin debate on the 2014 Transportation and Housing Spending Bill. And the Senate, meanwhile, is in today. They have voted to move forward on one of the nominees for the National Labor Relations Board. Also, debate expected in the Senate today on that 2014 Transportation Spending Bill. We'll take you live to the House floor now for general speeches here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., July 30th, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable John Abney Culberson to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 2nd, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 1:50 p.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Falio Mavanega, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, it's me again. I rise today on behalf of our Native American community to speak on the subject of great concern, the use of the term Redskins by the National Football League's Washington franchise. Recently, our nationally recognized commentator, Mr. Rush Limbaugh, attempted to wash away years of pain, suffering, and humiliation endured by our nation's first inhabitants by questioning their motives in seeking to rid of the NFL of this most racist, disparaging, and patently offensive word. As with most of the non-Native American general public, Mr. Limbaugh does not appear to know the violent and abusive history behind this racial epithet. I would like to take this opportunity to provide Mr. Limbaugh and the American people some much-needed clarity on the subject. You see, Mr. Speaker, much of the outcry over the name of the NFL's football franchise is due in large part to the federal government's protection of disparaging trademarks granted to the franchise for the word Redskins. Governing federal law established in 1946 requires that the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office deny registrations of any such words. The origin of the term Redskin, Mr. Speaker, is commonly attributed to the historical act of not only killing Native Americans, but also cutting off certain body parts and scalping heads of even women and children as evidence, and are then paid by the colonial officials. These scalps, Mr. Speaker, were described as Redskins. I submit, Mr. Speaker, Native Americans are human beings. They are not animals. Despite this most despicable act of genocide against Native American people, the U.S. Patent Office in 1967 granted the NFL's Washington football franchise a federally registered trademark for the same word. Mr. Speaker, this should never have happened. Native American nations have treaty and trust relations with the federal government, and it is clearly recognized by the Supreme Court in the U.S. Constitution. 66 years after the law was established, the word Redskins continued to enjoy such protections. In fact, the NFL's Washington football franchise has 6 federally registered trademarks for the same word. This is not the work of the Native American community, which Mr. Limbaugh calls a bunch of PC jerks. It was the work of a federal agency that ignored the law and its duty to shield our Native peoples from degrading trademark registration. Mr. Limbaugh asks, why does the federal government have to get involved? With due respect, Mr. Speaker, the federal government is part of the problem. After years of pleading with the NFL, Washington franchise owner, Mr. Dan Snyder, the Federal Trade Patent Office, the D.C. courts, the Native American communities left right where they started, with a $1.6 billion football franchise freely exploiting the shameful memory of an ethnic cleansing that was forced upon Native American people. Mr. Limbaugh also states, so the Redskins may not be a popular name with some people, Mr. Speaker, I submit this is not a popularity contest. It is not even about sports. This is a moral issue that reaches far back to the time when Native Americans are not only considered outcasts, but deemed enemies, rebels, and traitors by the colonial government. The only sporting involved was the game of hunting and killing Indians like animals for money. Mr. Limbaugh, to Mr. Snyder, to Mr. Goodell, and all NFL club owners, I ask, haven't American Indians suffered enough? Have they not paid the price placed on their heads, their scalps, their skins? Mr. Speaker, I think the answer is clear. Enough is enough. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, there are only 3 more days until the August recess. Given that no new public hearings are scheduled on Benghazi, it's apparent that the questions I've been asking for the past 2 weeks and the American people have been asking for more than 10 months will not be answered by the 1-year anniversary of the Benghazi attack, if ever. After a year of investigation in 5 different committees, we still do not know what happened, and no one's been held responsible. The House and the Senate have failed. Is it any wonder that the American people are losing confidence in their government? This is even more remarkable given that over 2 months ago, senior administration officials admitted to the media that they failed to properly respond to the attack in Benghazi, yet the Congress never pressed the matter further. In a little-noticed article published on Friday, May 17th, CBS News' Cheryl Atkinson reported that, quote, Obama administration officials who were in key positions on September 11, 2012, acknowledged that a range of mistakes were made that night of the attacks on the U.S. mission in Benghazi, end of quote. Atkinson continued, quote, the list of mea culpas by Obama administration officials involved in the Benghazi response and aftermath include standing down the counterterrorism foreign emergency support team and failing to convene the counterterrorism security group, among others. One of the key revelations from anonymous senior administration officials is the admission that it refused to deploy the Foreign Emergency Support Team, FEST. According to an article, the FEST's own mission statement describes a seasoned team of counterterrorism professionals who can respond quickly and effectively to terrorist attacks, providing the fastest assistance possible, including hostage negotiating experience, time-sensitive information and intelligence. In fact, FEST leader Mark Thompson says Benghazi was precisely the sort of crisis which his team is trained to respond. The article continued, as soon as word of the Benghazi attack reached Washington, FEST members instinctively started packing, said the official involved in the response. They were told they were not deploying by Patrick Kennedy's front office. In hindsight, I probably would have pushed a button, end of quote. It's particularly notable that the administration's sources pinned the decision not just on the State Department leadership, but also on the White House. Quote, while it was the State Department that said to have FEST taken off the table, the team is directed by the White House National Security Council. Speaking of the White House role in directing the response, Atkinson reported that the National Security Council also failed to convene the Interagency Counterterrorism Security Group, CSG, that evening. The article noted, quote, according to a public military document, it's part of a plan to synchronize the efforts of all the government agencies that have a role to play in the global war on terrorism. But on September 11, 2012, the Obama administration did not convene this body of terrorism expert advisors, end of quote. Given the number of agencies involved in the response, including the State Department, CIA, and Defense Department, it's hard to understand why the NSC's Interagency Terrorism Response Group wouldn't be convened. As Atkinson noted, because the CSG wasn't assembled, quote, there's evidence that some high-level decision-makers were unaware of all available resources. In October, on a phone call that included then Deputy National Security Advisor Dennis McDonough, now White House Chief of Staff, NSC spokesman Tommy Vietor initially told CBS News, quote, I didn't know what FAST is. It sounds antiquated, end of quote. Who are the anonymous senior administration officials who admitted their mistakes to CBS? Why haven't they testified to Congress about these mistakes? Why wasn't a FEST team deployed immediately? Last week, General Ham admitted that he believed Ambassador Stevens may have been taken hostage by terrorists. Given that FEST team's terrorism and hostage negotiation expertise, who made the decision not to deploy them? Why didn't the White House convene the CSG that night to coordinate the interagency response to the attack? And if that group wasn't responsible for coordination, who was? While the agency was leading the response that night, what agency? Was the State Department directing the Pentagon not to deploy its planes or response team while also not sending the FEST team? Mr. Speaker, I conclude with an important quote in the CBS article from NSC spokesman Tommy Vietor. Quote, "From the moment President Obama was briefed on the Benghazi attack, the response effort was handled by the most senior national security officials in government. The mistakes these anonymous senior officials admit to mattered. Lives were on the line. Ultimately, lives were lost. The Congress must compel these most senior national security officials responsible for the response team that night to testify publicly. We need a bipartisan select committee, and if we do not do it, the Congress and the House will have failed." I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 48 years ago to today, Lyndon Johnson in Independence, Missouri, signed into law the Medicare program in the presence of former President Harry S. Truman. It's important when you think about that event, which I would argue transformed our country, to go back in time and remember that seniors in 1965, only half had health insurance of any sort. 30% of America's seniors lived in poverty. Life expectancy for America's seniors was age 70. If you fast forward today, 48 years later, we have universal health insurance coverage for all seniors. Life expectancy is now age 79, and only 7% of seniors live below the poverty line. The decision by Congress earlier that year, it was April of 1965, when our colleague, Congressman John Dingell, was sitting in the Speaker's chair and brought the gavel down when the Medicare law was passed, has again paid off huge dividends in terms of transforming America's health care system. Back then, Medicare only covered doctor's visits and hospital visits. Today, it covers a broad range of services for seniors, dialysis, medical equipment, outpatient services such as prescription drug coverage, and as a result, the healthcare sector of our country has grown, and for many, it has created literally careers and opportunities to pursue a system which, again, has produced great results for the folks who live in our country over age 65 and people on disability. Now, today, you know, we have challenges that Medicare faces, but there is good news. The trustees for Medicare recently issued their annual report, and it showed that the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund this year was extended out an additional 2 years to 2026. And beyond that date, Medicare does not go bankrupt to zero. There is a shortfall in terms of the projections by the trustees of roughly about 10%. A serious problem, but one that we can manage using smart changes to the system. And the trustees in their report pointed to the Affordable Care Act when it was signed into law by President Obama in 2010 as extending by 9 years the solvency of the Medicare system. For seniors under the Affordable Care Act, they're now getting more help with prescription drug assistance. They were stranded in the donut hole prior to 2010. Now they get over half of the cost of those prescription drugs while they're in the donut hole discounted. They are also getting free preventive care services, whether it's colonoscopies, annual checkups, smoking cessation programs. All of those essential services for primary care are now carry no out-of-pocket cost because of the Affordable Care Act. The fact is that those changes have extended the solvency of the Affordable Care Act, and we have not cut benefits for seniors. We have not made unwise choices, such as the Ryan budget, which proposed raising the eligibility age for seniors to qualify for Medicare to age 67, and would butcher the program into private health insurance for people under age 55. In other words, turning the clock back to where we were 48 years ago when President Johnson signed that measure into law. The best way to celebrate Medicare's birthday, which again has transformed the lives of every American family since it was enacted in 1965, is to make smart changes to the system, to build on the progress of the Affordable Care Act, to make sure that it's going to be there for our children and our grandchildren, just like the people who had the wisdom to vote for that program 48 years ago and signed it into law, again, with the vision and prophecy of Harry S. Truman, who, as a senator representing the state of Missouri, had proposed Medicare as a law and then saw before his time on earth ended it actually come into fruition. Medicare is a wonderful program. It is a program which every family is touched by and has experienced and benefited from. Our best way to celebrate its birthday today is to redouble our efforts to extend its solvency and to make sure that all American families today and in the future are able to enjoy its wonderful benefits. And with that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, last week as we debated the defense appropriations bill for the upcoming year, my good friend Jim McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts, joined me in a measure that would guarantee that Congress would vote on funding the Strategic Partnership Agreement with Afghanistan. This agreement with Afghanistan is a 10-year agreement that will start after 2014. It has been negotiated and will soon be signed by President Obama and the President Karzai. During the debate, I quoted the former Commandant of the Marine Corps with regard to this agreement. I called him and asked him what he thought about the agreement. He sent me a paragraph back. I used one sentence that I will use again today, Mr. Speaker. Simply put, I'm not in favor of this agreement. It basically keeps the United States and Afghanistan to prop up a corrupt regime. It continues to place our troops at risk. The amendment failed. I want to thank the seven Republicans who joined me in that vote, along with 100 Democrats, but it failed. The problem is we really have no oversight in Afghanistan. It is a joke at best. The joke is, though, it's not really a joke because of the young men and women who are dying in Afghanistan even today. The waste, fraud, and abuse in Afghanistan goes unchecked. We send inspector generals over there. They do their best. But it is a no-win situation in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, according to a Washington Post ABC News poll just last week, only 28% of American people believe the war in Afghanistan has been worth fighting. I believe that that number would be even lower if they knew that we are going to sign a 10-year agreement with Afghanistan after 2014. If they were polled on that, I believe that the 28% would go down to about 8%. The American people are just finding out that we have this 10-year agreement with Afghanistan where we'll keep spending billions of dollars per month and have a presence of at least 10,000 to 15,000 military. During this same week, last week, a poll was done of Congress, and 12% of the American people approve of Congress. If it gets much lower, we'll be right at 0, and I'm not sure the American people will be wrong if they give us a 0, quite frankly, especially when I look at the fact that we continue to spend money in Afghanistan. We continue to cut programs right here in America for our young, our old, and our infrastructure. The American people are frustrated and fed up because they don't think we in Congress are listening to them. And when it comes back to Afghanistan and the fact that we would allow a 10-year agreement to go on with a corrupt leader in Afghanistan makes no sense to the American people. It makes no sense to many of us in Congress in both parties. Mr. Speaker, during that debate, I made the statement on the floor. It was at 10 minutes after 11 one night that probably no one on the floor, and in fairness to that statement, there were only about 10 or 12 people on the floor, that they probably did not realize, but from March 1 until July the 1st, we had lost 78 of our soldiers and Marines in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, that's why I brought this poster down today. It is a family. It happens to be the Army. They're prepared to walk behind a caisson probably at Arlington, to bury an American hero. The sad part about it, Mr. Speaker, is that there's a wife, I'm assuming, it looks like probably the wife. She has sunglasses on and a black dress, and she's holding the hand of her little girl, who appears to be 6, 7, maybe 8. And the little girl is holding her mother's hand, and the little girl has her finger in her mouth. How many more families in this country have to go through a sadness and a tragedy like this family, while we sit here in Congress and we never debate the war, or we'll debate the funding that we did last week? It was a 10-minute debate, 5 for my amendment and 5 against. Mr. McGovern and I had 5 minutes, and yet we do not debate the policy that continues to send troops, continues to send money, and all we do is continue to let this war go on and on and on. Mr. Speaker, it's not fair to the families who have loved ones in the military. Again, I will continue to come to the floor 1 time a week and rail about the policy in Afghanistan. It is a failed policy. History has said no nation has ever changed Afghanistan, and we are not going to change Afghanistan no matter how much money we spend, how much blood we spend, and it's not fair to our military. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will close by asking God to please bless our men and women in uniform, to please bless the families of our men and women in uniform. I'll ask God in His loving arms to hold the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. I'll ask God to bless the House and Senate that we will do what is right in the eyes of God for God's people. I will ask God to please bless the President that he will do what is right in the eyes of God for God's people today and God's people tomorrow. And 3 times I will say, God please, God please, God please continue to bless America, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I should address the House and revise next to my remarks.
Without objection, it is so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, in the world's poorest countries, nearly 1 billion people struggle with hunger every day. Chronic food insecurity limits a child's ability to grow, to learn. Across Africa and Asia, hardworking farmers need help producing enough food to feed their families throughout the year. And many of these farmers are women. In fact, it's estimated 80% of the agricultural workers are women. So earlier this year, I traveled to Tanzania and southern Sudan, where women farmers told me that they needed access to better seeds, tools, and training. With assistance from the United States and with our support, they can grow enough food to feed their families and have extra to sell as produce. Last week, I introduced the Global Food Security Act along with Representatives Aaron Schock and Jim McGovern. This bill directs the President to develop a strategy to improve global nutrition, food security, and agricultural development. More than 35 NGOs and faith-based groups also support this bill. This bill will improve food security for millions around the world, which is the right thing to do. But it will also make America more secure and protect our own national interests. I urge my colleagues to support the Global Food Security Act. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Black, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to honor Walter Thomas Durham, a man who did great things for Tennessee and for the future generations of Tennesseans. Tennessee has one of the great histories of our United States. Tennesseans fought and tipped the balance of the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Tennessee produced 3 of the first 17 presidents. Tennessee had more Civil War battles than any other state except Virginia. Tennessee is proud of its history, and Walter Durham is a giant in the world of Tennessee history. Like so many brave members of his generation, Mr. Durham served in the U.S. Army in World War II, seeing action in North Africa and Italy with his U.S. Army Air Corps. He went to Vanderbilt University, and after he graduated, he started a building supply company in Gallatin called Durham Building Supply. He went on to launch another business, Gallatin Aluminum Products Company, which he and his partners later sold. Then, in the early 1970s, he was encouraged by his doctor to establish a hobby that would reduce his stress. So at the suggestion of a friend, Mr. Durham started a book on the history of Sumner County. As Sumner County's history goes, the county has a pretty amazing one. Some of Middle Tennessee's earliest forts and settlements were in Sumner County. Sumner County had characters such as Caspar Mansker and Thomas Bigfoot Spencer, a man of legendary size and strength who once spent a cold winter alone living in a hollow sycamore tree. Sumner County was a place where there were violent raids made on early forts and cabins by the Creek and Chickamauga Indians. Walter Durham was hooked on history. In fact, his book on Sumner County's history would be the first of 24 that he wrote on the local and state history. He wrote books about the history of the thoroughbred racing in Tennessee, the Tennessee Governor William Trousdale, who fought in the War of 1812. He also wrote about James Winchester, another veteran of the War of 1812 and a man who co-founded the city of Memphis with Andrew Jackson, and a book about General Daniel Smith, a U.S. Senator and the surveyor who created the first map of Tennessee. He wrote a very detailed 2-volume history of Nashville during the Civil War, and those 2 books were one of the ones he later said he was the most proud of. He also wrote a book called Volunteer 49ers about people who left Tennessee to take part in the California Gold Rush. In fact, Tennesseans were some of the first people to hold public office in California. In short, Walter Durham created an entire shelf of books that people interested in Tennessee's history should have in their libraries, and he generously gave the book rights and proceeds to various entities across the state. In addition to writing, he was a longtime member of the Tennessee Historical Society, and he served as its president from 1973 to 1975. He was also the chairman of the Tennessee Historical Commission and the founding president of the Tennessee Historical Alliance, now known as the Tennessee Preservation Trust. In 2002, Tennessee Governor Don Sundquist appointed him to the official post of the Tennessee State Historian. He was appointed by Governor Phil Bredesen in 2008 to continue to hold this title until his death. 2 years ago, he was awarded the honorary doctorate from Tuscaloosa College to commemorate his work on behalf of Tennessee's historical significance. Mr. Durham also took time to encourage others. 10 years ago, a young man in Tennessee decided to start an organization to help public school teachers teach Tennessee history and civics using the Internet. His very first endorsement letter was from Walter Durham, a man who handwrote every one of his books in pencil. And these handwritten manuscripts now reside at the Vanderbilt Library Archives. He was also a devoted Sunday school teacher at the First United Methodist Church in Gallatin. Mr. Durham passed away on May the 24th, 2013. He is survived by his wife, Anna Armstrong Coley Durham, his wife of 64 years, and his 4 children and 4 grandchildren. Tennessee and the Durham family will miss this great man. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House to be in recess until 2 p.m. today.
And the House will come back briefly at 2 p.m. Eastern, back for legislative work this afternoon at 3 as they begin work on the 2014 transportation